The dirt beneath Margot Vaughn's boots had turned to dust by the third week of June, and she wondered if she would become dust too before this summer ended. She had arrived in San Antonio, Texas, just 2 months earlier with nothing but a worn leather satchel and the clothes on her back, fleeing a life that had nearly crushed her spirit entirely. The year was 1876, and the world seemed determined to test how much one woman could endure before breaking completely. Benjamin Morrison had watched her stumble into town that April morning, her face streaked with trail dirt, and her eyes holding the kind of haunted look he recognized from his own reflection. He had not spoken to her then, merely observed from beneath the brim of his hat as she approached the mercantile with hesitant steps. Something about the way she held herself, proud despite obvious exhaustion, caught his attention in a way he could not quite explain. Now she worked alongside him in his fields, the land he had fought to maintain after his father's death 3 years prior. The arrangement had come about through necessity on both sides. Margot needed work and a place to stay that did not require questions about her past. Benjamin needed help with the harvest and the endless labor that came with working a cattle ranch alone. His property stretched across 200 acres just outside San Antonio proper, far enough from town to offer privacy, but close enough to bring cattle to market when needed. They worked in silence most days. Benjamin was not a man of many words under normal circumstances, and Margot seemed to prefer the quiet. She had moved into the small cabin on the eastern edge of his property, a structure his father had built for hired hands years ago. It was modest but sturdy, with a wood stove and a bed frame his mother had insisted on before she passed. Margot had accepted it with a simple nod and the barest whisper of gratitude. The first week she worked for him, Benjamin had wondered if she would last. The work was brutal under the Texas sun, and many men twice her size had quit after only days. But Margot showed up every morning before dawn, her dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, her hands already calloused but willing. She learned quickly how to mend fences, how to guide the cattle without spooking them, how to read the sky for coming storms. She never complained, never asked for special treatment, never spoke unless absolutely necessary. Benjamin found himself thinking about her more than he should. During meals eaten in continued silence, he would steal glances across the rough wooden table in his kitchen where they took their midday break. She ate with careful precision, never wasting a morsel, suggesting she had known real hunger at some point. Her face was pretty despite the sunburn across her nose and cheeks, with high cheekbones and eyes the color of creek water in spring, somewhere between green and brown depending on the light. He wanted to ask about her past, about what had driven her to this solitary life, but the questions felt intrusive. Everyone in Texas came from somewhere else, running from something or towards something. He had no right to demand her story when he guarded his own sorrows so closely. Summer intensified with a vengeance. The heat became oppressive, the kind that made every breath feel like work. They moved through their tasks with grim determination, breaking for water more frequently but never for long. The cattle needed constant attention. The fields required irrigation from the creek that ran through Benjamin's property. And there was always something that needed repairing or building or salvaging. One afternoon in early July, as they worked together to reinforce a section of fence that had been damaged by a skittish bull, Benjamin's hand brushed against Margot's as they both reached for the same post. She jerked back as if burned, and he saw something flash across her face, something that looked like fear before she quickly masked it. "Sorry," he muttered, the first word either of them had spoken in hours. She shook her head, returning to the work without acknowledging the moment. But Benjamin felt the weight of it, the way that brief contact had revealed something fragile beneath her capable exterior. He worked more carefully after that, conscious of maintaining distance, not wanting to frighten her again. The incident stayed with him. That night, lying in his bed while heat lightning flickered outside his window, he thought about the way she had recoiled. Someone had hurt her. He was certain of it now. The knowledge made something protective rise up in his chest, an unfamiliar feeling that both confused and concerned him. He barely knew this woman. He had no claim on her, no right to feel anything beyond the respect of one worker for another. But the feeling persisted. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift between them. Margot started arriving at the main house a few minutes earlier each morning, helping him prepare the simple breakfast they shared before heading out to the fields. She never said much, but she would nod when he commented on the weather or mentioned the work ahead. Small acknowledgments, but they felt significant in the vast silence that usually surrounded them. Benjamin found himself talking more, sharing observations about the land and the animals. He told her about the old oak tree near the south pasture, where his father used to take him fishing in the creek below. He mentioned his mother's garden, now overgrown but still producing wild tomatoes and herbs. Margot listened, her hands never stopping their work, but he could see she was absorbing every word. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Benjamin was checking on a pregnant mare in the barn when Margot appeared in the doorway. She stood there for a moment, backlit by the dying light before stepping inside. "She is close," Margot said, nodding toward the mare. Her voice was soft, slightly rough from disuse but pleasant to his ears. "Tomorrow, I think," Benjamin agreed, running a hand along the mare's swollen belly. "Maybe tonight." Margot moved closer, reaching out to stroke the horse's neck. The mare leaned into her touch, and Benjamin noticed how gentle Margot's movements were, how the animals always seemed to trust her instinctively. "I can stay with her," Margot offered, "through the night, in case." Benjamin looked at her in surprise. "You do not have to do that. You have worked a full day already. So have you." She met his eyes directly for perhaps the first time since she had arrived. "And you need sleep more than I do. Your shoulder has been bothering you. I see how you favor it." He had not realized she had been paying such close attention. His left shoulder had indeed been aching, an old injury from breaking a horse years ago that flared up when he overworked it. He had tried to hide it, not wanting to seem weak or incapable. "I am fine," he said automatically. Margot's expression did not change, but something in her eyes suggested she knew he was lying. "Let me help," she said simply. There was something in the way she said it, a quiet plea underneath the practical offer, that made him realize this was about more than just watching a mare. She wanted to be useful, to prove her worth, to maybe even repay what she saw as a debt for the job and shelter he had provided. "All right," he agreed. "But come get me if anything seems wrong." She nodded, already settling onto a hay bale positioned where she could watch the mare comfortably. Benjamin hesitated at the barn door, wanting to say something more but not knowing what. Finally, he just touched the brim of his hat and headed back to the house. Sleep came fitfully that night. He kept waking, wondering if he should check on Margot and the mare, but forced himself to stay in bed. She had volunteered for this, and he needed to show he trusted her capability. Still, as the hours stretched toward dawn, he finally gave up on rest and dressed, heading out to the barn. The soft glow of a lantern spilled from the open door. Inside, he found Margot sitting on the ground now, her back against the stall wall, the mare lying nearby in the straw. Everything seemed peaceful, and for a moment Benjamin thought perhaps Margot had simply fallen asleep on watch. Then she turned her head and he saw she was fully alert, her eyes bright in the lamplight. Nothing yet, she reported quietly. But soon. Her breathing changed about an hour ago. Benjamin entered the stall, kneeling to examine the mare. Margot was right. The signs were all there. Within the hour they would likely have a foal. "You should have come to get me," he said, but without reproach. "You were sleeping. No point in both of us losing rest until necessary." They sat together in the straw, waiting and watching. The barn was quiet except for the occasional shuffle of horses in other stalls, and the night sounds drifting in from outside. Benjamin found himself acutely aware of Margot's presence beside him, the way her shoulder was only inches from his own, the faint scent of soap and hay that clung to her. "Where did you learn about horses?" he asked, keeping his voice low so as not to disturb the mare. Margot was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. Then, slowly, she began to speak. "My father had a farm in Missouri. Small place, but we had a few horses. I helped with the foaling every spring." She paused, her hands twisting together in her lap. "That was before." Benjamin waited, sensing there was more but not wanting to push. "He died when I was 16, Margot continued. "My mother had passed when I was young, so it was just me and him. The farm went to my uncle, my father's brother. He said I could stay, that he would take care of me." The way she said the last part, bitter and tight, told Benjamin everything he needed to know about how that arrangement had worked out. His jaw clenched with anger at a man he had never met. "I stayed for 2 years, Margot said, until I could not anymore, so I left, worked my way south, taking whatever jobs I could find, ended up here." She glanced at him, her expression guarded. "That is all, nothing special, just another sad story in a world full of them." "It matters," Benjamin heard himself say. "Your story matters." She looked at him fully then, searching his face for something, though he was not sure what. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken things, until the mare groaned and shifted, breaking the spell. The foaling took another hour, but it went smoothly. They worked together with practiced ease, Benjamin handling the physical aspects while Margot kept the mare calm with soft words and steady hands. When the foal finally arrived, slick and wobbling, Margot's face broke into the first real smile Benjamin had ever seen from her. "A colt," she said, wonder in her voice. Benjamin nodded, feeling his own sense of satisfaction at the successful birth. "Strong one, too. Look at him trying to stand already." They cleaned up the stall, made sure both mother and baby were comfortable, and finally emerged from the barn into the purple light of early dawn. Benjamin realized they had worked through the entire night. Exhaustion pulled at him, but there was also a strange energy, a feeling of having shared something significant. "Thank you," he said as they walked toward the house. "For staying with her, for trusting me with your story." Margot slowed her pace, looking out at the land that was beginning to emerge from darkness. "I have not felt safe in a long time," she said quietly. "Not since my father died. But here, working this land with you, I am starting to remember what that feels like." The words struck Benjamin in the chest, making his heart beat faster. He wanted to tell her she would always be safe with him, that he would never let anyone hurt her the way her uncle clearly had, that the thought of her leaving made something in him ache. But the words felt too big, too presumptuous. So instead he simply said, "I am glad." They parted ways after a quick breakfast, Margot returning to her cabin to rest while Benjamin forced himself to tend to the most essential morning chores before allowing himself a few hours of sleep. When he woke in the early afternoon, he found a plate of food waiting on his kitchen table, still warm, covered with a cloth. Margot must have brought it while he slept. The gesture touched him more than it probably should have. He ate slowly, savoring both the food and what it represented, a growing connection between them. a tentative friendship that might become something more if he did not ruin it by moving too fast or expecting too much. Work continued through the blazing weeks of high summer. The cattle required constant attention, and there was hay to cut and store for winter. Benjamin hired 2 temporary hands from town to help with the heaviest work, but Margot remained his constant companion in the fields. The other men treated her with initial skepticism, but her competence quickly won their respect. She could rope a steer as well as either of them and worked twice as hard to prove herself. Benjamin found himself feeling proud of her, which was ridiculous since her abilities had nothing to do with him. But he could not help it. Watching her hold her own among men who had been doing this work their entire lives, seeing the way she never backed down from a challenge, made something warm spread through his chest. The temporary hands left after 3 weeks, and Benjamin and Margot fell back into their usual rhythm. But something had changed between them during that time. They talked more now, real conversations about everything and nothing. Margot told him about books she had read as a child, about her mother's love of music, about the year the crops failed and how her father had somehow kept them fed anyway. Benjamin shared memories of his own childhood, of his mother's terrible cooking that they all pretended to love, of learning to ride before he could properly walk, of the day he realized his father was getting old and would not always be there to run the ranch. Their silences became comfortable rather than awkward, filled with the easy companionship of 2 people who understood each other without needing constant words. But Benjamin found himself wanting more. He wanted to hear her laugh, really laugh, not just the small huffs of amusement she sometimes made. He wanted to see her face free of worry and sun damage, relaxed and happy. He wanted things he had no right to want. August arrived with a series of violent thunderstorms that turned the dry earth to mud and made work nearly impossible for days at a time. Benjamin and Margot spent the forced downtime in the barn, mending tack and organizing supplies. The close quarters and constant sound of rain on the roof created an intimacy that made Benjamin's awareness of her even more acute. One afternoon, as they worked across from each other repairing saddles, Margot suddenly spoke. "Can I ask you something?" Benjamin looked up from the leather he was conditioning. "Of course. Why did you hire me? That first day when I came asking for work, you did not even hesitate. You just said yes." Why? He had known this question would come eventually. Benjamin set down the saddle, taking a moment to formulate his answer. "I saw something in you," he said carefully. "Something I recognized. You were running from pain, looking for a place to catch your breath. I have been there. After my mother died, then my father, I understood what it meant to need a place to just exist without explaining yourself to anyone." He met her eyes. "And I needed help. You needed work. Sometimes things are that simple." "Nothing is ever that simple," Margot said, but her voice was soft, not challenging. "Maybe not," Benjamin admitted. "But sometimes we make things more complicated than they need to be. You needed help. I could provide it. Everything else is just details." Margot studied him for a long moment, her fingers still absently working on the bridle she was repairing. "You are a good man, Benjamin Morrison, better than I expected to find in this world." His name on her lips did something to him. She had always called him by his first name, but hearing it now with that particular tone felt different, personal, intimate in a way that made his pulse quicken. "I am just a man," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "Nothing special. That is where you are wrong." She said it with such certainty that he had to look away, unable to bear the weight of her regard. The rain continued for another 2 days, and when it finally stopped, they emerged to survey the damage. A section of fence had been washed away, and the creek had overflowed its banks, leaving debris scattered across the lower pasture. It would take weeks to set everything right, but at least no animals had been injured and the house and barn remained intact. They threw themselves into the work with renewed determination. The sun returned with a vengeance, and the mud dried back into dust with remarkable speed. September approached, bringing slightly cooler temperatures and the promise of fall, though in Texas that promise often went unfulfilled until November. Benjamin noticed small changes in Margot as the weeks passed. She smiled more often, small expressions that transformed her face. She had gained weight, filling out the hollows in her cheeks that spoke of months of inadequate food. Her hands, though still calloused and work-worn, showed signs of healing from the desperate roughness they had carried when she first arrived. She looked healthier, stronger, more settled in her own skin, and more beautiful. God help him, but he found her more beautiful every day. It was not just her appearance, though that certainly affected him. It was the way she moved through the world with increasing confidence, the way she met his eyes now without flinching, the way she had started singing quietly to herself sometimes while working, little fragments of songs she must have known from childhood. It was the person she was becoming, or perhaps the person she had always been, finally emerging from beneath the weight of trauma and survival. He was falling in love with her. The realization hit him one evening as he watched her check on the foal they had helped birth, now a gangly youngster who followed his mother everywhere. Margot laughed, actually laughed, when the colt tried to nurse and missed entirely, stumbling in his enthusiasm. The sound of her laughter was like water in the desert, rare and precious and necessary. Benjamin knew he should probably keep these feelings to himself. Margot worked for him, depended on him for her livelihood and housing. The power imbalance was real and concerning. The last thing he wanted was for her to feel pressured or obligated in any way. She had already dealt with one man who abused his authority over her. Benjamin would rather cut off his own arm than make her feel unsafe or trapped, but the feelings grew stronger despite his attempts to contain them. Every shared meal became an exercise in restraint. Every accidental touch sent electricity through him. Every time she spoke his name, he wanted to hear it in different contexts, whispered in darkness, breathed against his skin, spoken with love. He tried to maintain distance while still being friendly. He focused on work and practical matters. He reminded himself daily that Margot's comfort and safety mattered more than his desires. But it was getting harder, especially when he caught her looking at him sometimes with an expression he could not quite read, something that might have been curiosity or might have been something more. October arrived, and with it came the massive task of moving cattle to fall pasture. It required long days in the saddle, camping out under the stars and working in close coordination. Benjamin hired 3 men from town to help with the drive, but Margot rode alongside them as an equal partner. On the second night of the drive, as they sat around the campfire after a meal of beans and hardtack, one of the hired men, a young fellow named Jake who had been making eyes at Margot since the drive began, moved to sit beside her. Benjamin felt jealousy spike through him, sharp and uncomfortable. "That was some fine riding today, Miss Margot," Jake said, his voice carrying the exaggerated charm of a young man trying to impress. "You handle a horse better than most men I know." "Thank you," Margot said politely, but Benjamin could hear the lack of interest in her voice. Jake either did not notice or did not care. "Say, when we get back to town, maybe you would let me take you to dinner. There is a new restaurant that opened up on Main Street, supposed to be real nice." Margot's back straightened, and Benjamin saw her fingers tighten around the tin cup she held. "That is kind of you, but no, I am not interested in courting." "Aw, come on now," Jake persisted, moving a bit closer. Just one meal, I promise I am good company. She said no. Benjamin's voice cut through the night air harder than he intended. That means no. Jake looked over at him, surprise and then understanding crossing his face. He held up his hands and backed away. Sure, boss, sorry. Did not mean any offense. The camp settled into uncomfortable silence. The other two hired hands exchanged glances but said nothing. Benjamin stared into the fire, angry at himself for being so obvious, for potentially embarrassing Margot or making things awkward. After a while, the hired men rolled out their bedrolls and settled in for sleep on the opposite side of the fire. Benjamin remained where he was, staring at the flames until he heard movement and saw Margot come to sit beside him. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for that. I should not have interfered. You were handling it." "I was, but it was nice not to have to." She pulled her knees up, wrapping her arms around them. Men like him never really hear no from a woman. They need to hear it from another man before it matters. The bitterness in her voice spoke of experience, and Benjamin's jaw clenched. That is not right. No, it is not. But it is the world we live in. She glanced at him, her face half shadowed by firelight. You are different, though. You have never pushed, never demanded, never made me feel like I owed you anything beyond honest work. You do not owe me anything at all, Benjamin said firmly. The work you do is worth more than what I pay you. If anything, I am in your debt. Margot laughed softly. We could argue about this all night. We could, he agreed, allowing himself a small smile. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the prairie, the distant lowing of cattle, the crackle of the fire. Benjamin was intensely aware of her presence beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her body, but he kept his hands to himself and his eyes on the horizon. "Can I tell you something?" Margot's voice was barely above a whisper. "Always. I think about staying here, permanently. Not just as a hired hand, but as something more." She paused, seeming to gather courage. "I think about what it would be like to call this place home. Really home, not just a temporary stop." Benjamin's heart hammered in his chest. He turned to look at her, trying to read her expression in the uncertain light. What would make it feel like home? She met his eyes, and he saw vulnerability there, but also determination. "You," she said simply. "Working beside you, building something together. Feeling like I belong somewhere with someone." The words hung between them, an offering and a question all at once. Benjamin knew he should be careful, should think this through, should consider all the complications. But he was tired of being careful. He was tired of pretending he did not feel what he felt. "Margot," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I need you to understand something. I am not offering you charity or obligation. If you stay, if you choose to make this your home, it is because I want you there. Because I cannot imagine working this land without you beside me anymore. Because somewhere along the way you became essential to me." Her breath caught, and he saw tears glimmer in her eyes. "Benjamin, I am not saying this to pressure you," he continued quickly. "You can keep working for me as you have been, and nothing has to change if you do not want it to. But if you are asking whether I want you to stay, whether I want something more with you, then yes. God, yes. I have wanted that for months now." Margot reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away if he wanted. Her hand touched his face, fingers rough from work but infinitely gentle. "I want that too. I have been afraid to hope for it, but I want it." Benjamin covered her hand with his own, turning to press a kiss to her palm. "You never have to be afraid. Not with me. Not ever." She moved closer, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her against his side. She fit there perfectly, her head resting against his chest, and Benjamin felt something settle in his soul that he had not even realized was restless. They stayed like that until the fire burned low, not speaking, just existing together in a moment that felt like a turning point. When they finally separated to sleep, both in their own bedrolls with the campfire between them and the hired hands, Benjamin lay awake for a long time, staring at the stars and feeling something he had not felt in years: hope. The cattle drive finished without further incident, and they returned to the ranch with the hired hands collecting their pay and heading back to town. Benjamin and Margot fell back into their routine, but everything felt different now. The silence between them was charged with possibility. The accidental touches lingered. The glances held meaning. Benjamin knew he should court her properly, take her to town for dinner, buy her flowers or whatever women liked. But Margot was not like other women he had known. She would probably laugh at flowers. She valued practical things, honest work, genuine connection. So instead of grand gestures, he showed his feelings through small acts. He fixed the window in her cabin that had never quite closed right. He left fresh vegetables from his mother's garden on her doorstep. He made sure she had the warmest blanket for when the nights started getting cold. Margot responded in kind. She mended his shirts without being asked. She made extra food and brought it to the main house. She started joining him in the evenings after work, sitting on his porch and talking about their days, their hopes, their dreams. One evening in late October, as the sun set in spectacular fashion across the Texas sky, Benjamin finally gathered his courage to speak the words that had been building in him for months. "Margot, I need to tell you something." She looked up from the piece of leather she had been working into a new bridle. "What is it?" He took a breath, meeting her eyes directly. "I love you. I am in love with you. I think I have been for months now, but I was too afraid to say it, too worried about making you uncomfortable or pressuring you. But life is too short and too uncertain to keep these things silent. So I am telling you now. I love you, Margot Vaughn, and I want to build a life with you if you will have me." Margot set down her work slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. For a long moment she said nothing, and Benjamin felt fear spike through him. He had miscalculated. He had moved too fast. He had ruined everything. Then she smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through clouds. "I love you too, Benjamin. I have been waiting for you to say something, hoping you felt the same way I did. I love you, and yes, I want to build a life with you." Benjamin crossed the space between them in 2 strides, pulling her up from her chair and into his arms. She came willingly, her arms wrapping around his neck as he held her tight against him. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, his face inches from hers. "Please," she whispered. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, both of them testing this new territory. But it quickly deepened, months of restrained desire finally finding release. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Benjamin rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know it is fast, but I am certain. Marry me, Margot, be my wife. Make this ranch our ranch, this life our life." Margot pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. "Are you sure? You have only really known me for 6 months. I have seen you at your lowest and watched you grow stronger. I have worked beside you through every kind of weather and challenge. I have learned your habits, your thoughts, your dreams. I know enough to know I want to spend every day for the rest of my life learning more." He cupped her face in his hands. "I am sure, but if you need time, I will wait. I will wait as long as you need." "I do not need time," Margot said, tears streaming down her face now, but they were happy tears. "Yes, yes, I will marry you, Benjamin Morrison. I will be your wife." He kissed her again, and when they finally separated, both of them were laughing with the pure joy of it. Benjamin took her hand, threading his fingers through hers, marveling at how right it felt. "We should go into town tomorrow," he said. "Get you a proper ring. Talk to the minister about a wedding." "I do not need a fancy ring," Margot protested. "Save the money for things we actually need." "This is something we actually need," Benjamin insisted. "I want people to know you are spoken for. I want you to have something beautiful that reminds you every day that you are loved." Margot's eyes filled with tears again. "I am not used to being loved like this." "Then it is time you got used to it, because I plan to love you like this for the next 50 years at least." They went into San Antonio the next day, riding side by side into town as the morning sun warmed the earth. Benjamin took her to the jeweler, an old German man named Mr. Schmidt who had been in San Antonio since before Texas was even a state. "Mr. Morrison," the jeweler greeted him with a smile. "I have not seen you in town for some time. What brings you to my shop today?" "I need a ring," Benjamin said, putting his arm around Margot's waist. "An engagement ring for my future wife." Mr. Schmidt's eyebrows rose in surprise, but he quickly smiled. "Wonderful, wonderful. Congratulations to you both. Let me show you what I have." He brought out a selection of rings, ranging from simple gold bands to more elaborate designs with small stones. Benjamin watched Margot's face as she looked at them, trying to gauge what she liked. She seemed overwhelmed by the choices, her fingers hovering uncertainly over the display. "That one," Benjamin said, pointing to a gold band with a small sapphire set in the center. "That is the color of your eyes when you are happy." Margot looked at him, then at the ring, and her face softened. "It is beautiful. Try it on," Benjamin encouraged. Mr. Schmidt handed her the ring, and she slipped it onto her left hand. It fit perfectly, the gold warm against her skin, the sapphire catching the light. "We will take it," Benjamin said, reaching for his wallet. "Benjamin, it is too expensive," Margot protested, looking at the price tag. "It is worth every penny." He paid the jeweler, refusing to hear any more arguments. They left the shop with the ring on Margot's finger, and Benjamin felt a fierce satisfaction at seeing it there. They stopped by the church next, arranging with the minister to perform the ceremony in 3 weeks, giving them time to prepare and for Benjamin to send word to his few remaining relatives. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Benjamin had the main house thoroughly cleaned, wanting it to be perfect for when Margot moved in as his wife. Margot sewed herself a new dress for the wedding, simple but beautiful, made from pale blue fabric they bought in town. They worked together on the ranch during the days and spent the evenings planning their future, talking about everything from how many children they wanted to what crops to plant next spring. The night before the wedding, Margot stayed in her cabin while Benjamin remained in the main house, honoring the tradition of not seeing each other before the ceremony. Benjamin lay awake most of the night, too excited and nervous to sleep. His entire life was about to change, and he could not wait. The wedding took place on a crisp November morning in 1876, with a small group of witnesses from town and a few neighboring ranchers Benjamin had known for years. Margot walked down the aisle of the small church alone, carrying a bouquet of wild prairie flowers Benjamin had picked that morning, her face radiant with happiness. Benjamin stood at the altar watching her approach, and his throat tightened with emotion. She was beautiful in her new dress, her dark hair arranged in a simple style that framed her face, that sapphire ring catching the light as she walked. But more than her appearance, it was the look in her eyes that undid him, the absolute certainty and joy he saw there. The ceremony was short and simple. They spoke their vows in clear, steady voices, promising to love and cherish each other through all the challenges life would bring. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and told Benjamin he could kiss his bride, he did so tenderly, aware of all the eyes on them but caring only about the woman in his arms, Mrs. Margot Morrison. The name sounded perfect. They held a small reception at the ranch, with the neighbors bringing food and well wishes. Someone brought a fiddle, and there was music and dancing as the afternoon stretched toward evening. Benjamin danced with his wife, holding her close and feeling like the luckiest man alive. When the last of the guests finally departed, Benjamin carried Margot over the threshold of the main house, both of them laughing at the tradition but honoring it anyway. He set her down gently in the front room and they stood there for a moment, suddenly shy with each other despite everything they had shared. "Welcome home, Mrs. Morrison," Benjamin said softly. "It feels like home," Margot replied, reaching up to touch his face. "Finally, it feels like home." He kissed her then, and the shyness melted away as passion took over. They made their way to his bedroom, their bedroom now, and loved each other through the night with tenderness and desire, sealing their commitment in the most intimate way possible. The next morning, Benjamin woke to find Margot already up, standing at the window and looking out at the land that was now as much hers as his. He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how different life looks from 6 months ago. About how I came here with nothing and now I have everything. About how grateful I am that you took a chance on a desperate woman who showed up asking for work." "I am the grateful one," Benjamin said, turning her in his arms so he could see her face. "You brought life back to this place. You brought life back to me." They spent the winter working the ranch together, now as partners in every sense of the word. The work was still hard, the weather still challenging, but everything felt different when shared. They developed a comfortable rhythm, knowing instinctively how to work together, when to speak, and when silence said enough. Christmas came, and Margot decorated the house with pine branches and candles, filling the space with warmth and light. Benjamin gave her a beautiful leather journal, knowing she sometimes liked to write down her thoughts. She gave him a new saddle she had been secretly working on for months, tooled with intricate designs that must have taken hours of careful work. "This is too much," he protested, running his hands over the beautiful leather. "Nothing is too much for you," Margot said firmly. "You gave me a new life. Let me give you something in return." Spring arrived, and with it came the back-breaking work of calving season. Benjamin and Margot worked around the clock, helping difficult births and making sure every calf made it safely into the world. They were exhausted but satisfied, watching the herd grow and thrive under their care. One evening in April, as they sat together on the porch after a particularly long day, Margot took Benjamin's hand and placed it on her stomach. "I think I am with child," she said quietly. Benjamin's heart stopped, then raced. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be. I have missed my monthly courses twice now, and I have been feeling sick in the mornings. I was going to wait longer to tell you to be more sure, but I could not keep it to myself anymore." Benjamin pulled her into his lap, holding her carefully as if she might break. "A baby, we are having a baby." "Are you happy?" Margot asked, searching his face. Happy does not begin to cover it. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "I am thrilled, terrified but thrilled." They told no one else for another month, waiting until Margot began to show before sharing the news with their neighbors and the people in town. Everyone was excited, especially the older women who immediately began offering advice, some helpful and some completely absurd. Benjamin became even more protective of Margot than before, trying to keep her from doing heavy work despite her protests that she was pregnant, not an invalid. They compromised, with Margot handling lighter tasks around the ranch while Benjamin took on the more strenuous labor. As summer progressed and Margot's belly grew, Benjamin found himself talking to their unborn child, his hand resting on her stomach to feel the baby kick. He told stories about the ranch, about Margot's mother and his parents, creating a family history for this little person who would soon join them. "I hope the baby has your eyes," Margot said one evening as they lay in bed, her head on Benjamin's chest. "I hope the baby has your strength," Benjamin countered, "and your heart. I hope the baby has your kindness, your integrity. I hope the baby knows how much they are already loved." Margot tilted her head up to kiss him. "They will. We will make sure of it every single day." The baby came in late September, on a warm evening that reminded Benjamin of the day they had helped the mare foal together nearly a year and a half earlier. The midwife from town, Mrs. Henderson, came to help, and Benjamin paced the front room anxiously while Margot labored in their bedroom. The birth was difficult and long, lasting through the night and into the next morning. Benjamin stayed nearby, holding Margot's hand when she needed him, giving her space when the midwife told him to. He had never felt so helpless in his entire life, listening to Margot's pain and being unable to do anything to ease it. But finally, as the sun rose on a new day, a baby's cry filled the house. Mrs. Henderson emerged from the bedroom, smiling tiredly. "You have a son, Mr. Morrison. And your wife is tired but well." Benjamin rushed into the room to find Margot propped up in bed, sweaty and exhausted but radiantly happy, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. She looked up as he entered, and her smile widened. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Benjamin approached the bed carefully, awed by the tiny person in Margot's arms. The baby had a shock of dark hair and was making soft, snuffling sounds as he nuzzled against his mother. "Can I hold him?" Benjamin asked, his voice breaking with emotion. Margot carefully transferred the baby into his arms, and Benjamin looked down at his son's face, seeing features that were somehow both him and Margot and completely unique, all at once. The baby opened his eyes, and Benjamin felt his heart expand with a love so fierce it actually hurt. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I am your father. I have been waiting to meet you." "What should we name him?" Margot asked. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but never settled on anything definite. Now, looking at his son, Benjamin suddenly knew Samuel, after my father. "Samuel Morrison." Margot smiled. "Samuel, I like that. Hello, Samuel. Welcome to the world." The baby fussed a bit and Margot took him back to nurse. Benjamin sat on the edge of the bed, one arm around his wife and one hand resting on his son, feeling complete in a way he had never imagined possible. The first few months with Samuel were exhausting but joyful. The baby was healthy and strong, with a good set of lungs that he used frequently, especially at night. Benjamin and Margot took turns walking him, soothing his cries, marveling at every little change and milestone. Running the ranch with an infant was challenging, but they managed. Margot wore Samuel in a sling while doing lighter chores, and Benjamin hired a young woman from town, a widow named Mrs. Clara Thompson, to help with the baby and the house a few days a week. As Samuel grew, his personality emerged. He was curious and determined, always reaching for things just beyond his grasp, always trying to do more than his little body was ready for. He had Margot's eyes and Benjamin's stubborn streak, and both parents were completely smitten with him. One evening when Samuel was about 6 months old, Benjamin came in from the fields to find Margot on the porch, rocking their son and singing softly. The setting sun painted everything in golden light, and Benjamin stopped to just watch them for a moment, overcome with gratitude for this life he had somehow been given. Margot looked up and saw him watching. "What is it?" she asked with a smile. "Just thinking about how much I love you," Benjamin said, coming to sit beside them. "Both of you. We love you too." Margot leaned against his shoulder and they sat together as the day faded into night, their son between them, a perfect symbol of the life they had built. Years passed in a blur of seasons and growth. Samuel grew into a bright, energetic toddler, then a curious young boy who followed his father everywhere, asking endless questions about the ranch and the animals. Margot thrived as a mother, patient and loving but also firm when needed. She continued to work the ranch alongside Benjamin, the two of them a seamless team that ran the operation with increasing success. When Samuel was 3, Margot became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and the birth, while still difficult, went more smoothly. They welcomed a daughter, whom they named Elizabeth after Margot's mother. She was smaller and quieter than Samuel had been, with blonde hair that surprised them both and Benjamin's steady temperament. 2 years later, another son arrived, whom they named Daniel. He was the loudest of the 3, making his presence known from his first breath and never really stopping. Benjamin joked that Daniel would probably grow up to be a preacher or a politician with a voice like that. The ranch continued to prosper under their joint management. Benjamin made decisions about the cattle and the land, but he always consulted Margot, valuing her insights and opinions. They expanded slowly, buying an adjacent property when the owner decided to move back east, increasing their herd and their productivity. Samuel showed an early aptitude for working with horses, gentle and patient in a way that reminded Benjamin of Margot. Elizabeth loved the animals but preferred helping her mother in the garden, growing vegetables and herbs with dedicated care. Daniel was still too young to show clear preferences, but he seemed to enjoy anything that involved getting dirty and making noise. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Benjamin surprised Margot with a trip to San Antonio, leaving the children with Mrs. Thompson for 2 days while they stayed at the new hotel in town. It felt strange to be away from the ranch and the children, but also wonderful to have time just for each other. They had dinner at a fancy restaurant, walked the streets of the growing town, and spent a lazy morning in their hotel room just talking and being together without the constant demands of children and ranch work. "Can you believe it has been 10 years?" Margot asked, lying beside him in the hotel bed, her head on his chest. "Some days it feels like forever. Others it feels like just yesterday that you showed up asking for work." Benjamin stroked her hair absently. "I am grateful for every single day we have had together, even the hard ones." Margot asked with a slight smile, "Especially the hard ones. Those are when I see how strong you are, how strong we are together." He kissed the top of her head. "You are my partner in every sense of the word. I could not do any of this without you." "You would manage," Margot said. "But I am glad you do not have to." They returned to the ranch and their children, slipping back into their routine with the ease of long practice. The years continued to unfold, bringing challenges and triumphs in equal measure. There were droughts that tested their resources, cattle diseases that required constant vigilance, harsh winters that made every day a struggle. But there were also good years, when the rains came at the right time and the calves were strong and the prices at market were high. There were birthdays and holidays, neighbors gathering for barn dances and community events, the slow building of a life rich in connection and meaning. Samuel grew into a capable young man, taking on more responsibility around the ranch and showing a good head for the business side of things. Elizabeth, quiet but perceptive, became her mother's right hand, managing the household and the garden with competent ease. Daniel, true to form, was loud and cheerful and somehow always in the middle of whatever mischief was available. When Samuel turned 18, Benjamin and Margot officially made him a partner in the ranch, recognizing his contributions and his commitment to the family business. It was a proud day for all of them, marking Samuel's transition into adulthood and ensuring the ranch would have someone to carry it forward into the next generation. More years passed. Elizabeth met a young man at a church social, a farmer's son named Thomas Brennan, who treated her with obvious respect and affection. Benjamin gave his blessing for Thomas to court her, and a year later, they married in the same small church where Benjamin and Margot had spoken their vows decades earlier. Daniel decided he wanted to study law, a surprise to everyone but something they supported. He moved to Austin to attend university, promising to visit often and always maintain his connection to the ranch that had shaped him. As Benjamin and Margot moved into their 50s, they gradually began stepping back from the day-to-day operations of the ranch, letting Samuel take the lead while they offered guidance and support. It was strange at first, after decades of constant work, but also liberating in a way neither had expected. They had more time for each other. For long rides across the land they had worked together for so many years, for quiet evenings on the porch watching the sunset, for traveling to Austin to visit Daniel, or to the nearby farm where Elizabeth and Thomas had settled with their growing family. One evening, as they sat together on their porch in the place where so much of their relationship had unfolded, Margot took Benjamin's hand. "You remember that night on the cattle drive?" she asked. "When I told you I wanted to make this place home?" "Of course I remember." "That was the night everything changed. I have been thinking about that conversation lately, about how terrified I was to hope for something good, to believe I could have this kind of life." She squeezed his hand. "Thank you for giving me a reason to hope. Thank you for loving me the way you have." Benjamin raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "Loving you has been the easiest thing I have ever done. You made me whole, Margot. You took a lonely man working a ranch by himself and gave him a family, a purpose, a reason to look forward to every single day." "We gave those things to each other," Margot corrected softly. "That is what partnership means." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Benjamin thought about that day so many years ago when a desperate young woman had walked into town looking for work. He thought about all the moments that had followed, the silence and the words, the struggles and the triumphs, the family they had built together from nothing but hope and determination and love. "I would do it all again," he said suddenly. "Every single part of it. The hard times and the good times, all of it, just to end up here with you." Margot turned to him, her eyes bright with emotion even after all these years. "Me too. 1,000 times over, me too." He kissed her then, tender and sweet, a kiss that held decades of love and commitment and partnership. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. Inside the house, they could hear Samuel talking to his wife, a woman named Julia whom he had married 2 years earlier. They were discussing plans for expanding the herd next spring, their voices animated with enthusiasm. It reminded Benjamin of himself and Margot in the early years, that same passion for the work and the land. "We did good," Margot said, clearly listening to the same conversation. "They will carry on what we built." "We did better than good," Benjamin said. "We created something that will last. Not just the ranch, but the love and commitment that built it. That is the real legacy." As they grew older, Benjamin and Margot settled into the peaceful rhythm of their later years. They still helped around the ranch when needed, but mostly they enjoyed watching their children and grandchildren carry forward what they had started. Elizabeth and Thomas had 3 children who loved visiting the ranch, and Daniel eventually returned from Austin with a law degree and a quiet wife named Margaret, settling in San Antonio but visiting frequently. On their 40th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. The house was filled with children and grandchildren, with laughter and stories, with the warmth of family bonds that had been carefully nurtured over decades. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, Benjamin and Margot slipped out to the porch one more time, unable to break the habit of a lifetime. The November air was cool but not cold, perfect for sitting outside with a blanket wrapped around their shoulders. 40 years, Margot said wonderingly. How did that happen? One day at a time, Benjamin replied. One moment of choosing each other over and over again. Best choice I ever made. Second best for me, Benjamin said with a slight smile. Margot looked at him in surprise. What was the best? Saying yes when you asked for work. That was the choice that made all the others possible. Margot laughed, the sound still as beautiful to him as it had been that first time he heard it all those years ago. Fair point. I suppose we both made good choices that day. They sat together, wrapped in their blanket and in the comfortable intimacy of 4 decades together, and watched the stars wheel overhead. Benjamin thought about all those months they had worked in silence, how desperate he had been to find the right words, how terrified she had been to hope for anything good. He thought about that moment when he had finally spoken, when he had told her he loved her and asked her to build a life with him. It had felt like such a risk at the time, a leap into the unknown. Now, looking back across 40 years of marriage, 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and countless moments of joy and sorrow shared equally, he could see it for what it really was. Not a risk at all, but the surest thing he had ever done. I love you, Margot Morrison, he said, the words as necessary now as they had been the first time he spoke them. I love you too, Benjamin Morrison, she replied, her voice strong despite her age. Always have, always will. They sat together as the night deepened around them. 2 people who had found each other in the vast loneliness of the Texas prairie and built something beautiful together. The ranch spread out before them in the darkness, land they had worked with their own hands, blessed with their sweat and tears and love. Inside the house, their family slept, proof of the life they had created. Tomorrow there would be more work, more moments to share, more memories to build. But tonight, there was just this. 2 people, 1 blanket, and the quiet certainty that comes from a lifetime of love faithfully given and gratefully received. The stars shone overhead, ancient and constant, bearing witness to their story as they had to countless others throughout time. And beneath those stars, Benjamin and Margot Morrison sat together on their porch, holding hands and watching the world they had built together, content in the knowledge that they had done what so few people manage to do. They had found real love, nurtured it through hardship and joy, and made it last. That was their legacy, more than the ranch or the cattle or the land. The legacy was the love, passed down to children and grandchildren, a model of what commitment and partnership could be. It was the proof that sometimes, when 2 wounded people find each other and choose to heal together, something miraculous can happen. As the night grew deeper and the air cooler, they finally headed inside, arms around each other, still moving as one unit after all these years. They prepared for bed with the comfortable familiarity of longtime partners, each knowing the other's routines and preferences without needing to speak. In bed, Margot curled against Benjamin's side, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. This was how they had slept for 40 years, and this was how they would sleep for however many years remained to them. Good night, my love, Benjamin whispered into the darkness. Good night, Margot whispered back. And in the morning, they would wake together as they had for 40 years, ready to face another day side by side. Because that was what they did. That was what they had always done. That was what they would continue to do until the very end. 2 people who had worked the fields together in silence until the cowboy finally said the words she needed, and in saying them, had changed both their lives forever. Two people who had found in each other exactly what they had been searching for, even when they had not known they were searching. Two people who had built a love that would last not just their lifetimes, but echo forward through generations, a testament to what is possible when two hearts find their home in each other. And that, in the end, was the story worth telling. Not of the hardships endured or the successes achieved, but of the love that had made it all meaningful. The love that had started in silence and grown into something that filled their entire world with warmth and light and purpose. The love that had saved them both.